I was actually hoping for that.
I love your team.
Yes, I love you too. I'll jump off the boat.
Okay, Paul, find a seat. You're working the room up. There you go. It is my honor to welcome all of you to the 7th Annual Wiswell-Robeson Lecture at Monmouth College. The lecture's purpose is to feature each year a speaker who explores issues, challenges, and innovations in the vital industry of agriculture. It is altogether proper that such a lecture exists at Monmouth College. First, of course, the college sits in the midst of one of the world's great breadbaskets. Also, many of the college's alumni have distinguished themselves at the state, national, and international levels in various aspects of agriculture. In addition, the Wiswell-Robeson Lecture complements several other food and agriculture-related initiatives at the college. For example, for over a decade, college faculty and students have maintained a garden and farm near campus. Other members of our faculty are engaged in additional curricular innovations in agriculture, including, for example, the application of data science to farming. And finally, Monmouth was the only liberal arts college among the charter signatories of Presidents United to Solve Hunger, a United Nations-sponsored initiative to bring the energy of colleges and universities from around the world to address hunger. The Wiswell-Robeson Lecture, one of the college's most distinguished lectures, was established in 2016 through a generous gift from Jean Giddings-Robeson, a 1960 graduate of the college. Jean and her late husband Don, who was a 1954 Monmouth graduate, operated their farm in Warren County from 1960 to 1996. Jean carried on a family legacy of women in farming stretching back to the 1880s. Please join me in thanking Jean and her current husband Louis Gould for their generosity and support. And let me also ask you to join me in wishing Jean an early birthday, which is happening this Sunday. Happy birthday. We are also honored to have Lauren Lurkins as this year's speaker. You will hear more about her in just a moment, but I want to thank Lauren for her work as she partners with the agricultural community to ensure that our land continues to produce the bounty that farmers provide the world. It is now my pleasure to invite one of our most distinguished faculty members, Professor Emeritus of Economics Ken McMillan, to come to the podium to introduce the 2023 Wiswell-Robeson Lecture. Professor McMillan.
When I met Jean Robeson more than 40 decades ago, it took no time at all to learn that her major priorities were Monmouth College, farmers and agriculture, and sound public policy. And those priorities were really the basis of her commitment and her founding for this lecture. This year, the focus is on opportunities facing farmers in the future if they are actively engaged in the present. Now, to find the best possible professional for this challenge, Jean chose Lauren Lurkins, founder and the principal of the consulting firm Lurkins Strategies. Now, why is Lauren Lurkins an excellent choice? Number one, Lauren has a depth of training in science. She majored in environmental science at St. Louis University. She works as a scientist and works with university scientists and researchers as they build our body of science knowledge. Second, Lauren understands farming and agricultural issues. She served 10 years as Director of Environmental Policy for Illinois Farm Bureau, working with and for farmers and earning their strong respect for the work she did on environmental issues locally, state, and nationally. Number three, environmental policy means environmental law. And Lauren is a seasoned lawyer. She has a law degree from Southern Illinois University, and 10 years of law firm experience as a defense attorney. Few people can combine a commitment to science, experience in farming, and credentials in the law, as well as Lauren Lurkins does. So, to present the 7th Annual Wiswell-Robeson lecture entitled "The New Defense of Farmers: Why Farmers Should Be Actively Involved in Environmental Policy Issues." I'm proud, on behalf of Jean and her family, to present Lauren Larkins.
When I grow up, I want to be Ken, okay? Thank you so much for that intro. It's the best intro. I might start crying before I even get started. So thanks to Ken, obviously, to Monmouth College, and to Jean. It has been lovely to get to know you, and you're an inspiration. We both found out that we have twin sisters, so there's two of each of us running around the world, which is really exciting. I see a lot of familiar faces here in the crowd tonight. Many folks that I have had the chance to work together with over various capacities. We don't have the privilege of doing that as often anymore, but there's a couple people in the room that we've learned a lot together. We've worked really hard on behalf of the farmers in the state, and also at the national level, and we had a heck of a lot of good time and fun along the way. So I'm glad that they're here, and very proud to know everybody. So my plan tonight is to make sure that you can know a little bit about me beyond that amazing intro. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my background and my current work. And then I also want to let you know about some of the substance on the environmental issues that are facing farmers here in the state, and then also at the national level as we sit here today. And just a spoiler alert, the way I think about these issues, I think about them in two different categories. The first are those issues that are old and never go away, no matter how hard we try. And the second are the ones that are new, complex, challenging, and kind of make your brain hurt when you think about the solutions that it's going to take us, into the future. And then I want to share with you my perspective so that we can talk about what we should be doing about any of it. And in particular, when I say we, I mean the farmers. What our farmers can and should be doing about all of these issues that seem a little bit challenging. So for the non-farmers in the crowd, do we have any non-farmers in the crowd? Thank you for coming. I appreciate your interest in hearing about the challenges and opportunities that today's farmers face as they continue to try to provide the food, fiber, and fuel that our society needs. And that they do so in a way that is trying to protect the environment and make sure that they're in business for generations to come. And I encourage you to ask questions of me or the farmers in the crowd as you're here tonight so that you can continue to learn more. Do we have any students in the crowd? Great. I've been here on campus since 11:30 today talking to students, and I think just judging from their faces when I'm talking in the classroom, I did not miss my calling as a college professor. So I think I'll stick with a different audience, but I love that you're here and that you took the time out on a rainy Monday night to come and listen to what I have to say. You may come from a farm background and you're interested in just agriculture, or like me, you maybe have zero farm background and just an interest in the farm. Or you may have an interest in the environment and you care very deeply about what we as a society are doing to make it a better place. And I want you to know that you're here and your concerns are heard. Or you may be a student who's curious about different educational backgrounds, career trajectories. And so to the former, I would say, we hear your concern. We want to be able to share our story from an agricultural perspective because there's a lot of good work happening on farms across these couple counties right here, but across the state and the nation. And I think the farms and the environment will benefit from that work. And to the latter, I just encourage you to pick an area of work that you are curious about and to be open-minded and use your education as a foundation and use your curiosity to guide your career. I was in 5th grade when I told everybody, including a couple boys that drove me crazy in my 5th grade class, that I wanted to be an environmental lawyer whenever I grew up. I had no idea what that really meant, but I was very firm in it. And so I obviously went to school, as Ken laid out, majored in science, went to law school, became an environmental lawyer. The same boy that annoyed me in 5th grade also became a lawyer. plaintiff's attorney, just to be clear. And I would have never guessed I would be standing here today having worked for 10 years for agriculture, having not grown up on a farm, and that I would now have my own consulting firm still working on behalf of agriculture on these issues. So I would just say, get that foundational education, but keep an open mind about where your future can go. All right, so you already heard a little bit about my background from Ken. I've been in this field in the legal and policy world, and I do agree with what he said about environmental policy is law. We started out talking about, in law school about the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and all of the federal environmental laws, but they trickle their way down into the state, and they're continuously being evolving and revolutionized. There's not a whole lot of opportunity for us to go back as a society and rewrite the Clean Water Act, but we talk about the regulatory structure that has come, for instance. So it's very tied into the law. Most of these environmental issues deal with multiple levels of government all at once, obviously the state and the federal, but even at the federal level, we could be talking about, and we will talk about this here in a second, issues that are before our U.S. Supreme Court are parts of rulemakings and also pieces of proposed legislation, while also still being debated over and over again at the lower court. So it's really helpful to have that legal background whenever I'm working on these issues. Like I said, it kind of bounces from the state to the federal level, and we look at through really that whole of government approach, the legislative, the regulatory, and also the legal. I did start my career at a law firm representing multiple industries, some ethanol plants, petroleum refineries, ag retail facilities, but then I had the opportunity to work for the Illinois Farm Bureau, as Ken said, for over 10 years. And so I would say it's kind of funny now to think back that the majority of my career has been spent working for farmers, and it's pretty fun. We still have a long way to go on a lot of these issues, but you'll see some of these issues here in this discussion that shows you they don't go away quickly, even though we wish they would sometimes. And the best experience that I have in my career is not really the time that I spent sitting in a law firm, but really the time that I spent working for the state's largest farm organization. And like I said, many folks are here tonight that I met through that process, but I have learned so much through that experience, not only about government and regulation and the issues, but the impact that all of that has at the farm gate, and the impact is very real. And I just feel very privileged to have had the ability for people to share very intimate details of their operations, their businesses, and their families with me, and I feel like I'm a better advocate for having heard it. And then I had the ability to spend some time, I was just telling some folks I got kicked off an EPA committee when I left the Farm Bureau, but I did have some experiences to work at the federal and state level on a number of advisory committees. So when I think back about this background and what I'm about to say next, which is what I'm doing now, I see a thread. And I was a trained defense attorney. That's why we're talking about my vision for the new defense of farmers with regard to environmental issues. But the thread that I see in my career, kind of going back and thinking about what I want to do in this next phase, is really advocacy. I think we can all know our substantive issue, but I love the advocacy side of things. I like taking challenging issues and breaking them into manageable, smaller steps, building relationships and building coalitions to really make incremental changes over time that are really impactful for whoever I'm advocating for. I also really think that good science leads to good policy. So that is why we spend a lot of time with our academic institutions in the hard sciences to make sure that when EPA or USDA are looking at the science, that it's something that makes some sense on the farm. So what I'm doing now, over the summer I left the Farm Bureau and I started my own consulting firm. So when they invited me to do this presentation, I was still employed at the Farm Bureau, and I was very excited for the opportunity, and so I was very nervous to tell mainly Ken that I was leaving the Farm Bureau. Like, will you still have me? He's like, well, yeah, we're still gonna have you. So, but this has been a very challenging point in my career for me. I've left a law firm and went to work for a trade association, but this is different. And you, if there's farmers in the room today, I think you'll appreciate this, but this time I'm working for myself, which has got its benefits and its drawbacks, but for the most part, I'm still doing the work that I love, working on issues that are important and that still touch the people that I know that really need the help here in Illinois. So my work is broken into 3 different areas. The first is really this regulatory work in the environmental area for trade associations, largely agriculture groups, to still work on these environmental, legislative, and regulatory issues. So I'm a registered federal and state lobbyist. The second is that I'm still keeping a lot of my connections, particularly with the Illinois State and mostly the University of Illinois, with regard to agricultural research. I met a lot of amazing people through my time at the Farm Bureau, and these scientists want to help farmers figure out the tools in areas like water quality, soil health, climate change, and there's just more work that we need to do. So I'm very lucky to continue to collaborate with them and to hopefully still call some of my farmer friends if we need help along the way. And then the third most exciting area that I'm interested in, I'm a big reader of the Wall Street Journal every single day. My kids try to interrupt my reading in the morning, but I love to read about it because I'm fascinated with sort of venture capital and investment in ag, tech, climate, all of the ESG discussions, which we'll talk about here in a minute. So I think it's an ever-evolving area, and there is a massive amount of investment that is being geared at agriculture. So for a lot of reasons, I think it's very exciting, but they also, for about 99% of their investments, are looking at agriculture under the lens of sustainability. So how we can continue to produce food, fiber, and fuel by having less of an impact on the environment. And I just find that fascinating. I also want to make sure that that technology maybe works on the farm for the people that I know and work for. All right, so as we think about our 2 buckets of issues, the first slide that I have here are a couple of issues. That's how I speak, but they're just terms. And if you're a farmer, you're probably looking at this list and you're thinking, yeah, I've heard presentations on this, I've read countless articles on these issues. I've actually testified at public meetings or hearings in front of Congress or legislatures, and I've met with my elected officials and I've shared my view on one or more of these issues. If you are one of those people, thank you very much. Keep doing what you're doing. But if you're not and you want to know what's going on in these issues today, this is what this discussion is all about. So let me walk through these issues one by one. Whoops, I went too far. Technology. So these are my old issues. You got a sneak peek of what's coming. Water quality is the first of these issues that are old and never going to go away, because it turns out the environment is a rather complicated place. And when we want to make it better, the solutions involve humans, and it involves a lot of moving parts, and it takes time to really get where we want to go with regard to environmental progress. And so there's a couple areas within the bucket of water quality that I want to talk about. The first is something that if anyone's listened to me talk for the last decade, you know I'm not going to let it go by, but it's called the nutrient loss reduction strategy. This is an opportunity that was put in the laps of state governments by EPA and USDA. Lots of litigation down in the Gulf of Mexico and concern from environmental groups across the country that we are not doing enough to reduce the size of the hypoxic zone in the Gulf of Mexico. There is a task force at the federal level that involves a lot of states. They have to report to Congress every year what the progress is of this work. They also have NOAA, one of the scientific surveys, go down and do a cruise of the Gulf every year to measure the dead zone. And so it is something that gets a lot of public attention, a lot of scrutiny to not only wastewater treatment plants, but also agriculture. That's your fertilizer use and your manure use and livestock in general. And so it is very exciting. An organization that I've been part of for the last decade is a coalition at the federal and state level called the Ag Nutrient Policy Council. I still have the ability to work for them on this very issue, and I'm very grateful for that. because the focus from the federal government and the general public is not easing up. We've seen restrictions in the form of regulation on fertilizer use and manure application across multiple states. We have not yet seen the US EPA engage and make it a blanket approach across the 30-something states that eventually discharge into the Gulf. And so it's really exciting that in each state we have these sort of locally led strategies. That's a very good thing, it's a great opportunity, but for agriculture, it's also a responsibility. And it's the responsibility that never really ends, because we have to continue to sort of prove our case and give the evidence of, look at what we're doing on the land, look at how our water is improving. There is a lag time when you do things on the land to see water quality improve. It takes time, but it takes a sustained effort at making those changes on the land. So it's not a quick fix. There are some discussions here in the state of Illinois, most recently, and I saw an announcement at the Farm Progress Show, of a coalition of agriculture groups here in the state trying to work through ag retail and present data at the farm gate on the 4 R's, cover crop use and otherwise. Now, of course, we have USDA data, but people really want that data at the farm gate collected in a way that protects the privacy of the farmers. And so I know all the ag groups were working with the Fertilizer and Chemical Association under their leadership to get that job done, and I was happy to see the first report come out. The other issue that I want to talk about, which is also one that we could never let a meeting like this go by without talking about, but it's very important with regard to water quality, is Waters of the U.S. This is the regulatory effort that has been underway for a number of years. There was one version under the Obama administration, 2 versions of the rule under the Trump administration, and then we just had the second version of the rule under the Biden administration. So that's 3 different rulemaking efforts in the last 10 years, and it's exhausting. This is one of those where we call it modus fatigue, because everybody's like, why is this issue not over with? But this is where a nerdy environmental lawyer and policy wonk like myself really gets excited, because when else would you have the US Supreme Court making a decision and rulemakings and litigation all happening at the same time? It truly is this issue. So the big question within Waters of the US is federal jurisdiction over water, not just in farm fields, but across the country. Farmers and ranchers obviously have a huge stake in that decision. But we had a very favorable decision out of the US Supreme Court back at the early part of the summer, called the Sackett decision that many people have read about, and then the US EPA and Army Corps just released their version reacting to that Supreme Court decision. So this is very important because they're defining the features on the land where the federal government would have jurisdiction. Practically speaking, if you're a farmer, that means you would have to go to EPA for approval on more of the work, or the Corps on more of the work that you want to do on your farm. So it is the issue that many people in DC coalesce around. So American Farm Bureau, for instance, a lot of the clients that I have now are all engaged continuously on how to make sure that we continue to talk on the Hill, and also have that legal advocacy happening as well to make sure that we know. The end of that story is not done. We just have the most recent rule out, which people are criticizing from both sides, but it is a narrowing compared to what we saw before as far as jurisdiction. And somewhat good news. The second issue that we have here, and these first 3 are sort of related, they all interlap at some point, but this next one is fertilizer. You know, obviously we're scrutinized in agriculture for fertilizer use. A very big misunderstanding in maybe the public about how farmers use fertilizer. You guys and ladies just dump it all over because it costs nothing, and it rolls into the streams, and you just pour it on. So we have a lot of discussions with the general public about the use. So that's being scrutinized in the context of water quality. One of the areas that I think is actually a very good example of advocacy, people working together here in the state of Illinois for a good outcome for farmers, is actually with regard not for environmental reasons, but for safety reasons, and that's anhydrous ammonia. For a number of years there have been releases, right? There's always seasons of application where you have releases. In the spring of 2019, there was a very big release in the Lake County area outside of the Chicago suburbs. And it involved quite a few people who have never heard the words anhydrous ammonia, and they thought it was car fire and smoke, and a lot of people were sent to the hospital. That incident got the attention of many state lawmakers in that area, whose first reaction was, ban it. Never let it happen, take it off the roads, don't let people use it. It was a very big coalition effort across all of the ag groups to have conversations with lawmakers and to educate them about how important the use of anhydrous ammonia is. And then instead of legislating, we were able to change it to a regulatory approach that turned it into a certified training for growers that need to apply. We already had it in the industry, in the ag retail, we had a very similar training, and so this is now open to farmers. And the exciting thing was when we first started it, the Farm Bureau and IFCA, the Fertilizer and Chemical Association, worked really closely with the Department of Ag. We were able to certify 12,000 producers within like 4 months with the use of in-person and ag retail connections and also online training. I don't think we've ever done anything that fast in the state of Illinois before. And so my point is, it can work. You know, if we find the right approach, we will have the ability to get people energized and get them the training that they need when it's done correctly. Because it would have gone a whole different way, in my opinion, if we had just banned the product. My other takeaway from that is that we have to think outside of the box in our advocacy and come up with not just a no, but with some solutions that are palatable, and we have to maintain those relationships on both sides of the aisle so that they can understand where we're coming from. In that case, that's exactly what happened there. All right, and then my other issue with regard to fertilizer is actually something that I think is really important. This kind of ties a lot of the threads that I had mentioned in my work in the consulting firm, but it's research. We, forever in Illinois, had our research buckets for fertilizer efficiency research sort of emptied by our state government. Then our farmers years ago decided to change the Fertilizer Act together with the Fertilizer Association, and we now have a collection that has spent over $32 million on fertilizer research in the state of Illinois, with environmental groups at the table with ag retail and our fertilizer and our ag groups. And so we have actually invested in that research to figure out what can happen on the farm to benefit the environment while still providing nutrients to our crops. That's called the Nutrient Research and Education Council, and I would encourage you all to take a look at that if you haven't already. But the conversations around fertilizer these days are very interesting. This is an area of change, of new product innovation, and really thinking differently about things. A lot of the ideas are obviously efficiencies, biologicals. We've talked about nitrification inhibitors for a very long time. We're talking about ammonia volatilization inhibitors and also some slow release formulas. So I think the world of biologicals, people used to say, you know, it's like snake oil. I don't know what I'm buying here, but there's more and more conversations about biological products and that's an area of major innovation as well. All right, the next issue is one of my favorites, and it's livestock. I will confess, I know nothing. Ken and I were talking about how we raise sheep. I know nothing about how to raise livestock in a practical way. I only have a golden doodle named Ruby at my house that I can barely take care of. But I do know about manure, and that's what I talk about most days. And I don't know if Gail Baker is here or if I missed her, but she and I like to talk about, she is. We like to talk about manure a lot and share manure resources with each other, like fun podcasts and news articles. But I don't know if you've heard, but our livestock groups have been kind of the target of environmental activist groups for a very long time, and it really is because of that manure. They can also be, if they're not environmental activist groups, they're concerned about animal welfare and the hormones or other products that are used, but the environment seems to be the issue that can draw them to continuously, essentially, attack the livestock industry. There's been rounds of additional regulation on livestock farms. We do have regulation of livestock farms as a nation and as a state, but it's never quite enough, and it's definitely the subject of a lot of litigation continuously. So if you're a livestock farmer and you haven't heard a lot about new pressures, that's not because they haven't happened, it's because they're being taken care of. But there is always the chance that if we don't have those relations and those ongoing conversations with people about regulation, that we will see something happen very differently. And I'll give you an example. So within the past couple months, there have been just revisited versions of environmental court and administrative petitions filed by a number of environmental groups across the country and filed with US EPA. And essentially, they're multiple pages, they say a lot of things. They're not a lot of new arguments, but they're basically saying, EPA, for all of these reasons, you need to do more to regulate livestock because of our water or our air. And in these cases, EPA, most recently about a month ago, they said, no, we feel like we're working on these issues and we are going to bring together a committee of various viewpoints, including farmers and environmental groups, and we will study this in the future. So if you're a livestock farmer, you may want to forget that I have your phone number, because in the very near future, we're going to be able to put new voices on a coalition effort to see, A, what's the reality around livestock farms today, and B, what do we need to do to regulate them more, if anything. But this is a situation where EPA, they have done this before, but EPA, in response to a petition from environmental groups, could have just agreed to things in a closed-door meeting, and we would have read about it when the rule was released in a proposed form. That is not the case, because we have ongoing relationships with them, that they knew that there was a little bit more to the story than in the petition that was filed. So I see that as a very good thing, and also job security, because these issues never go away, and we always have to continue to show up and advocate with the information that we have. I will say that there is a lot of discussion, and I'll talk about this here in a minute, on climate and climate change and agriculture's impact on the climate, and livestock is part of those discussions. Obviously, we have emissions from our livestock operations, and there's a massive interest at the state level and at the federal level on not just manure management, but on methane digesters. We've on several calls with the state agencies and also the federal agencies, where they have all this money that they want to find a way to make sure we get more methane digesters on the farms. Then they find out how much they cost, and they're like, what are we going to do about that? But that's where engineers like Gail come in to help. All right, air quality is still a big issue. Obviously, through the years, you all in agriculture have talked about air, whether it's dust, whether it's tractor emissions. Things are continuously changing. What's interesting is some of the work that I do now is with regard to swine production and egg production. And this just tells you the longevity of these issues. About 20 years ago, parties representing swine, dairy, and egg production all entered into a settlement with US EPA saying, do not regulate us yet with regard to air emissions. We will study them for the next 2 years, is what the legal agreement said. We'll study these emissions for 2 years, then we will all agree to methodologies, and then we'll come apply for air permits. 17 years later, the methodologies have not been figured out, because it turns out it's a little bit complicated of an environmental exercise. We don't have the methodologies, we don't have the emission factors, and people have lost their agreements. And so we are here negotiating with brand new people at EPA and new farmers who, in the case of egg production, have in many ways gone completely cage-free, so all of those emission factors make no sense anymore. So you have to start all over again. But air emissions are still being scrutinized by not only the environmental community, but also EPA itself. So there's more conversations to have there. All right, moving on to pesticides. This is just a quick mention, but this took up a lot of my maybe last 5 years at the Farm Bureau, because we have sort of a new approach, in my view, as regulation of pesticide product registration and the use of pesticide products in our country. There is a federal law called the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, Rodenticide Act, or FIFRA as we like to call it by the acronym. That is assuming that you will kill something, a critter, a plant, something, by the use of this product. So it's a cost-benefit statute. And it is coming cross purposes with the Endangered Species Act because you would be putting said plant critter in jeopardy. That has been a big issue in the courts, which has compromised a lot of the products that folks have used. One example is dicamba. In the middle of a growing season, having a Ninth Circuit court in the state of California make a decision that impacted farmers as they're literally going out to apply the product. That is not regulatory certainty. That is the opposite of regulatory certainty, and that has been a challenge. But another example of what those decisions are looking like that is very different, another example is the Enlist label that was pushed out in the winter of 2021. It has I call it the Panera. Anybody go to Panera very often? The you pick two option. You can pick the sandwich and the soup or the salad and the soup. You pick any of these practices and then you can apply the product, but the labels look very, very different than they used to. And another one that is a big deal is atrazine. I know that would change the look and feel of agriculture here in Illinois, and it's still an ongoing issue, but we saw proposed labels out from EPA less than a year ago that would drastically reduce the use of the product with a very tenuous tie to science in those practices. So that is still being debated. And I will say too that pollinators tie in here in pesticides, obviously with endangered species in mind. The monarch butterfly is what I kind of think about as the polar bear. As the polar bear is for climate change, the monarch butterfly is for these issues. It's not that great of a pollinator, but it is a species that everybody knows and loves. My second grade son was just telling me about the butterflies emerging from his chrysalis over the weekend at his school. People care about the butterfly, and if you tell them that the monarch butterfly is endangered, they are very concerned about the environment. But there are listings before the federal government right now saying we think the populations are in trouble and we need to change how we're operating as a society around them. So that's another issue. All right, my last set of issues here on my old but lovely issues are federal conservation programs. I had a question in the environmental ethics class that I spoke to this morning, and they said, well, how does our society deal with farmers and environment? And I said, that's a great question. We have in our society chosen voluntary, incentive-based conservation. Most of those programs, as you know, come through the USDA. That doesn't count all the things I just told you about coming from EPA. But when we talk about conservation programs, we talk about them in the context of the Farm Bill, which is currently being negotiated. And please, nobody ask me if we're going to have a Farm Bill by the time that it's supposed to be done. I would bet no, but I don't want to take any bets. But I'm very interested in this because in 10 years of working for farmers on conservation issues, I heard nothing but complaints about these programs because they are, well, I heard that they're supported, but they are very difficult to navigate for a lot of people. And that's not saying that's 100% of the issue, but in my conversations with USDA, Natural Resource Conservation Service now, they seem to be understanding that, and they're saying that they're trying to take steps to streamline these programs like EQIP, CSP, and others, and CSP. But I don't know what that's going to look like or how quickly they're going to get that done. One thing that is changing the dynamic here is something that you probably read about, but in the Inflation Reduction Act, they put out about $19.5 million additionally in all of those programs for NRCS. So they're hiring more people, and they've got a lot more money to put toward these programs. And on calls even a week ago, they're saying, we will get the job done. We will spend this money. So it's a very interesting time. The programs are still the same, but they have more funding than they ever have. The other thing that's happening out of USDA is turning these programs with a bend toward climate change, and also an additional $3.1 billion of climate-smart agriculture projects. When I was at the Farm Bureau, I tried to get one of these grants, so I'm kind of bitter about it because we were not chosen, but 141 other projects were chosen. The top amount of money that could be awarded was $90 million. This money has to be spent by April of 2028 in these programs. So why am I going on and on about the numbers and the dates because we haven't even begun to see that investment reach its way to the farm gate. But it's this very interesting intersection of academia, government, and industry all working together with agriculture and climate in mind. And Illinois is in that area. So I think it's going to be interesting. I'm parts of conversations with some of these projects, but it's really looking at not just USDA typical tried and true programs, but how do we make the climate models better? How do we pay farmers for these practices? So I am making zero promises that this will actually turn into anything, but how could it not when you have that many people working toward the same goal with actual resources behind them? I'm just very curious about what we're going to see presented to farmers before the spring of 2028. All right, that's my old news. You tell me when you have those solved, okay? And then I'll take them off my to-do list. Here's what I'm excited about and what I'm challenged by today, and these are issues that I'm working on for current clients, and I'm sure that the Farm Bureau is still working on them. The first is a term called environmental justice. This is not a new issue. This is an old issue, but it's the idea that people, all people, regardless of where you live, what color your skin is, how much money you have, that you have the right to clean air, clean water, and clean land, which is obviously something that everybody would agree to, but it ends up being a concept that can be a little bit challenging in how it manifests itself in regulation and legislation, and it's a topic that is kind of difficult to follow. I will say, I mentioned this is not an old issue. There were, a number of years ago, there's a US EPA office in the city of Chicago that touches about 5 states in the Midwest. And I was there with some of my board members at the Farm Bureau at the state level, and we walked down the hall. This was at the beginning of the Trump administration. We walked down the hall, and there were maps along the side of each of the states, and the environmental justice, or EJ areas, were shaded in red, and they were basically the whole state of Illinois. So these traditionally were like areas of, like the south side of Chicago, were very industrial, where you care about people living right across the street from heavy industry, and now it is really by definition out in rural America. It's based on minority population and also your economics of your community, and so depending on how you look at the issue, it could be something that impacts agriculture in a lot of ways. What would those ways be? Those ways are if you need to get a permit from EPA or maybe other state or federal agencies for water or for air to operate, you would have to go through a longer process, a more expensive process, or maybe never-ending process to site a new facility or to expand. And you bring on a lot of scrutiny and a lot more basically PR work that you need to do with your neighbors. It's not just agriculture, but it's also the supporting industries for agriculture. So this is an issue where you've got advisory boards at EPA, you've got advisory boards at the White House, and there's constant conversation about what this issue looks like in the future. Again, it's a very important cause. People have worked for their entire lives if they're advocates in this space for EJ communities, and so it's something that, as agriculture we can't dismiss, but we have to figure out a way to work together. When I was at the Farm Bureau, this was an issue that we were dealing with at the state level for about 3 years in a row with the business community. So it is one I think that will continue. The second is a little bit different of a vibe, and that's the ag tech. That's that venture capital and investor interest. And so they're always looking at ways that we can use technology to have better impact on the environment, to keep workers safer, to have less air emissions, to clean up the water, to use fertilizer in a more efficient manner. But I did find it funny, as I mentioned, I read the Wall Street Journal every day as long as my kids will stop interrupting me, and I read an article about a week ago, and I think the title was something, America's Farmers Are Drowning in Data, or Drowning in Tech, and the point was, we have all this fantastic tech, and most of the farmers that have the ability to access it are having trouble keeping up with where it's headed. I am not a farmer, and I am just trying to start up a small consulting firm in my own home, and I can't handle keeping up with technology, so I can only imagine. But no one had an answer in this article about what to do with farmers and their need to better understand and take advantage of technology, but it is happening, and you're still seeing all of these investments in ag tech. And again, it's moving quickly, it's focused on sustainability, it's about energy use, water use, and even keeping people safer and thinking about having less labor on the farm. The next issue is ESG. I don't know if that's a term that's familiar to a lot of people, but it's environmental and social governance. We've had a lot of conversations around this at the state level. We're talking about it from the perspective of investors and environmental groups and consumers, all wanting to know what either publicly traded companies or some cases private companies are doing to benefit the environment and also social and governance issues. I'm going to be focused on environment for the most part, but it is a massive effort. There's a couple things that are underway. There's a lot of things happening in Europe. I know we don't like to talk about Europe very often, but it is happening over here. It is regulation, and as of the 2024 year, you'll have lots of the large companies and also publicly traded companies in Europe that have to have these sort of GHG emissions reports in their filings with that government. There's also been proposals at the national level here in the United States through the Securities and Exchange Commission to require publicly traded companies to report their GHG emissions from beginning to end, including what we call Scope 3 emissions, which would include data at the farm gate. That came across a lot of backlash from the agriculture communities, lots of privacy concerns, lots of accuracy concerns about the data and the models because they are not fully developed for that purpose yet. And then, citing my favorite publication, the Wall Street Journal, this morning, and this is probably the third time I've mentioned the state of California in this speech, but in the state of California, by Friday of this week, they're actually making decisions on their own version of the Scope 3 reporting, which has got them all bound in controversy in the state of California. So if you are a public or private company in the state of California, you would also have to report your Scope 3 emissions. So when we talk about emissions, we talk about what is the impact on air quality and on GHG emissions and carbon from growing corn, from soybeans, from your livestock, and people wanting to gather data on that for purposes of corporate reports that are not tied to the farms. There's a lot of concern about that. And still a little bit to go. All right, and the final issue, which is my favorite and the most exciting area, is with regard to fuels. I think this is something that I spend a lot of time talking about with other people. I know it can be controversial when we talk about pipelines, so I'm not here to talk about pipelines because I don't know much about them, but I am interested in the nudges from our federal government which start to think about the future of things like ethanol and biofuels. And I think it's important to kind of tell you where we are. So the Inflation Reduction Act, that infusion of money back in August of 2022, it included that $19.5 million that I told you about for the NRCS programs. It also extended and modified some existing renewable energy tax credits, and it developed some new ones as well. And so this is a very timely issue. It's continuing to change. I saw this morning in one of the ag publications that National Corn Growers Association and a lot of the state Corn Grower Association sent a letter to Janet Yellen saying as the IRS goes to write their rules on all these tax credits that they need to be using modeling that was actually coming out of Argonne National Labs here in the state of Illinois. So it's very timely. You still don't know all of the details on how it's going to be implemented. But the important thing is to think about, without getting into all the detail in the interest of time, that the Biden administration has set a goal of producing 3 billion gallons of sustainable aviation fuel in the U.S. by 2030. So those of us that, we like to fly on commercial jets, those commercial airlines are being asked by either Europe and other countries to document their carbon footprint, or their consumers or their shareholders or their boards to do so and to bring that number down. So sustainable aviation fuel is a topic that we hear a lot about, and there's 2 phases to what the Biden administration wants to do. The first phase is they want to apply some fuel blends to fuels sold during the 23 and 24 years. And that's one section of the tax credit or tax code. Phase 2 would apply to the SAF that's produced and sold from 2025 to 2027. So if you're like me, you have to remember, what year are we in? Okay, we're toward the end of 2023. These are things that are going to happen very quickly, and the infusion of capital is happening now, and it's going to continue happening because a lot of these are triggered by domestic biomass. You need to be producing this with corn and soybeans here in the US, not from palm oil down in other countries. Here in the state of Illinois, Illinois also passed its own SAF agreement, and you would get additional incentives as of this past June to be able to do it. So that's why you hear a lot of conversation here in Illinois about the change. How it ties back though to conservation on the farm is that for all these biofuels and ethanol plants to get the true credit, they really need crops that are grown using climate smart practices like fertilizer management. Cover crops is a big deal, as well as tillage practices. So there's a lot of conversations about carbon intensity scores and all the way down to the farm gate. That way, as you produce corn, soybeans, you take it wherever you need to go, that you're going to be able to maybe get additional value with the crop. So I have no idea what the details of this would be, nor does anyone else. Maybe Jane Yellen knows, we have to ask her. But this is very timely, and we would expect these rules to come out this fall, so there's lots of advocacy opportunities there. But the drivers behind all of that are really these tax credits, the low carbon fuel standard in other countries and in California. That's probably the 4th or 5th time we've talked about them. And again, you're seeing a lot of capital investments either being discussed or about to be discussed here in Illinois and our neighboring states that can help meet those goals on a very, very quick timeline whenever you think about it. So my thought is farmers very much need to be engaged and aware of what's happening in those conversations. All right, so with all that in mind, let's just take a step back. Those are the old issues, the new issues. They kind of are my to-do list. I'm a very to-do list oriented person, but these are the issues that are on it. Some of them may go away for like a minute, others don't, and they stay away. So how are you feeling once you hear that list of issues? Are you feeling excited about the future of agriculture? Are you feeling overwhelmed? Are you feeling confused and hungry and tired and you're ready for your midnight snack and you need to go home? I will tell you how I feel about it. I told you in the beginning that I really like complex issues that you can take bite by bite and take small measurable steps toward progress, and you can build coalitions and build the voice. But I keep coming back to advocacy on all of this. I think there's a lot of opportunity. Yeah, there are challenging issues. They're at the global scale, they're at the national scale, they're at the state level, and they're in a complex environment that we've created with all these layers of laws, but also the environment itself where we want to continue to operate our farms. But I look at this from an advocacy standpoint, and I look at it from an opportunity standpoint, because never before, you guys tell me you've been farming longer than I've been engaged in agriculture, some of you. But I think that never before has agriculture been so central and integral to the solutions that our society is searching for the climate, for water. And I think that's a great responsibility, but it's all, and a challenge, but it's something that I think the farmers that I have known and worked for can certainly rise to the occasion. So there's no shortage of issues. And I do believe that the change is happening more rapidly. These are not the times where we even always get the opportunity for a public notice and comment before people issue new rules. And it's hard to keep track of, even if you're tracking the ag media or traditional media, to figure out, okay, how does that work if the Supreme Court says this and these courts say that and the government is doing this, and it's a little bit overwhelming. But my thought is, the best defense for farmers today is to get engaged. You can get engaged individually, you can could do that any day. You can join an organization, you can be more active in the Farm Bureau, you can get your friends to be more active in the Farm Bureau, the corn growers, the soybean, the fertilizer association. But my thought is that if we all let this pass us by and we put our head in the sand and we just say, no, I don't have time to deal with this, it's all gonna pass us by, and farmers will have had zero opportunity to make it something that's more palatable for them. So my thought is, your only regret here, if I'm your defense attorney, I'm giving you a recommendation. As a lawyer, I can't tell you what to do. I can only tell you about the options on the table for settlement, and you decide what you're going to do. My only thought is that if you choose to do nothing, you're going to regret it in 2 years' time, 5 years' time, and maybe even beyond, but it will be very immediate. So, my last pitch is take time to get educated. You're already smarter on these issues than I ever thought about being, but continue to keep up with them. You know, find experts, call those experts, stop by and talk to them, read, listen to podcasts when you're harvesting, read, you know, opinions that you maybe wouldn't always think about, but try to challenge yourself to think about these issues from new perspectives and be open to new ideas, new technology, new partners, new coalitions, new membership organizations. But that doesn't mean you have to take it all and say, yes, this is all perfect. Don't be afraid to tell people when it doesn't work for you, because that voice and that practicality is perfect in a lot of these situations. They need to understand you know, how it would impact you on the farm. But again, my only thought is we have to do something, and the best defense that I can give to you is for you to be your own advocate, just like the organizations are for you. So with that, I just want to say thank you for listening. I'll stop and take some questions.
We have time for a couple of questions. You work with US EPA as
I think they want you to talk to Mike, even though I can hear you. I think other people want to hear you.
Okay. You worked with US EPA in Chicago for a number of years, successfully, I believe, but have you seen a change in their attitude over that time? Are they easier to work with, harder to work with, issues changes? What kind of relationship have you had, and how successful have you been for us?
Yeah, does anybody in the audience work for US EPA? Just kidding. Well, I will say that I felt, so I talked before about how, yes, we have state agencies that are located in Springfield, and we also have the federal EPA, which has headquarters in DC, and they also have regional offices. Our region is multiple states, but it's based in downtown Chicago. When I first started at the Farm Bureau, because of my other job, I would have had no reason to need an ag person within EPA. I knew other people that worked in air and water and all the lawyers, but I didn't know any ag people. And I tried to call and like build relationships, and they were like, yeah, we don't really need to talk to you. We have a guy that's doing it, you know, half of his time. They made changes, and I will give the federal EPA a lot of credit. Under the Trump administration, they added regional agriculture advisors into each of those regional offices. So now there is a career staff person, not a political appointee, who is in each of those, and their main job is to continuously have conversations with agriculture groups. That's not a small task. You know, this is like 5 or 6 states that this person has to get to, but that is a major step forward. So once we had someone in place, well, we helped create that, and then once we had that someone in place, yeah, it's going better. Sometimes I wish that script would be flipped a little bit more, where we're able to influence a little bit more about what happens at the agency, instead of them just telling us what we read in a press release. But I think that will be a continuous challenge. But again, if we have a relationship, all the ag groups in the state have a person and have a relationship, and then you can build from that. That same ag advisor is also located, there is another person who is political appointee in DC, and he does a phenomenal job. And I would say, when I look at the to-do list and how EPA internally is making their decisions now, he personally and his relationships with people like me and others that's why we're getting some of these outcomes here, is because of a long, couple decades worth of not always comfortable, but very productive conversations. And that's what we have to continue to do. These are my friends, they're the ones that are standing up.
So, Lauren, I think agriculture, a lot of another industry are suffering from whiplash due to whether it's executive order or regulatory overreach, and not saying that one administration is better than the other, but it seems to be a function that we had to live with when, in fact, shouldn't more of these things be legislated so we had more of a reach into it? I'd be interested in your perspective. If we go so far down the road on executive orders that we're never going to get back, or is there a way to get back?
Yeah, so I think, when I look at new administrations kind of coming into place, you have almost like a campaign week, right, after they take office, and it's turned into that very much so over the last couple administrations. So day one, you get an executive order on this campaign priority. Day two, another one. And so those truly are setting the tone for what they're going to work on. That EJ issue and the climate issue were just a couple of the subject matters of executive orders under the current administration. And they are true to their word, right? But it's the long game through one term, maybe two. And my perspective is both sides, whether it's a Dem or Republican, they're really going hard as they can, and throwing all the spaghetti at the wall to see what will stick. A, what can they get done, and B, what will stick after all of it. And this is the time in an administration where it's just overwhelming to almost keep track of, because it all started back with executive orders, and then for EPA, for instance, you've got people that have been like locked in the closet working on certain rules, and they're all coming out for proposal, it feels like, at the same time. Electric vehicle mandate at the same time as an RFS rulemaking. It's all coming out at once, and it's the same audience of stakeholders that would have to react to it. So it does feel like that pendulum swing. A lot of these issues, if you're working as a political staffer at EPA or USDA under an administration, you're trying to move, like, I'm a terrible sports analogy person, I don't know if that looks obvious to you, but you're trying to move the ball as far down the field, that way when the next team comes, they have a harder road to hoe the next time around. I think that is going to continue, because that seems to be what people characterize as progress these days, which is not the way that maybe we would prefer them to do it. So you've got things hung up in regulatory agencies. The regulatory agencies have a lot of deference in the courts, where they have up until this point. We'll have to see where that goes. And you have a lot of people continuing that litigation churn around anything. And even, the term within Congress, they can always rewrite the rules or try to put the pause button on some of the rules under the new administration. So it's just challenging to track, but at the end of the day, a lot of it sticks, or a good percentage of it sticks, and that's what they're working on, I believe.
One more question.
Gail, do you have a manure question for me? Darn it. Okay, oh, there's one.
Hi. I wanted to ask, in terms of the, especially a lot of the environmental activism and regulation that environmental groups ask for, or are, sort of agitating for. In your opinion, sort of experience as a lawyer and also as an environmental scientist, how much of the legislative considerations are driven on the basis of this activism as opposed to grounded in like real environmental science? Because there does seem to be a disconnect in terms of even what like state regulatory agencies, the rules that they implement, and like the lacking of hard science that backs up sort of the cost-benefit analysis, regarding those rules. So what has been your experience, and how does Illinois sort of fare in that?
How does Illinois what? What was the word?
Like, how would Illinois rank in terms of being sort of grounded in the science as opposed to, maybe just the political considerations of it all?
Those are really good questions. I think science is difficult for people to understand. I was in this one meeting that I'll never forget where we had this task force in the General Assembly for months and months and months, and it was all about groundwater and the Muhammad Aquifer, which stretches across a larger part of the central part of the state. There were a lot of these lawmakers and also mayors and others that were there for meeting after meeting, and someone, like meeting number 5 says, "Can I stop you and can you tell me what is an aquifer?" Like, oh no, we have been in here for hours. And so I do think it's very complicated. I was always told by many people that I worked with at the Farm Bureau that data and facts don't buy votes, and so that's not always the science, and the facts of the matter are not always what people are interested in, which I always found that depressing, because then what are we doing here? But I know there is an element of truth to that, but I do think that there's a world of talking points and high level, and then people figure out the details later. Some could say that happens a lot. I mean, it's happening in that example of the IRS and the tax credits. We got to get this commitment out. Here's what we're going to do. Then we'll figure out, the actual details later. Same thing happened with all the climate smart $3 billion of programs. We're going to put this money out there, then we're going to figure out the rules of the game afterwards. So I think that is a common problem, a challenge, right? A reality that we have to deal with. All these ideas are meaningful and good. It's all down to the practical details of how we're going to get there. And a lot of people don't have patience to figure out everything before we move forward. So I think that is a common situation. And I think Illinois, no matter who would be in charge, you always have elected officials at the top that want to make campaign commitments, campaign promises, and then follow through with those. So I think we're right in line with some of the top states that do that.